Well, I'm very honored to be able to be with you guys today, take over the Greek class for a little bit. We're going to do something a little bit differently, obviously, but we'll have some Greek in there. If this is God's country, I should say that Las Vegas is probably a land flowing with filth and money. It's a good place. It's an interesting place. It was 80 degrees when I left this morning, so I'm feeling a little on the cooler side, but I actually don't mind. It's dry and nice. But what we're going to do with Galatians today is we're just going to kind of do an overview. We're going to talk about backgrounds, we're going to talk about the message, and we're going to talk about some application. So let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we thank you so much for this opportunity to study your word. Pray that you would speak to us today, that you would equip us and empower us to be able to understand what you have for us, to apply it to our lives, and to live it out in your world. We pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so with Galatians and with any letter of Paul, really, we have a difficult issue of trying to understand what Paul's letters are in response to, right? What provoked what we have in Paul's letters, right? In fact, there's a whole kind of set of memes, a whole subgenre of memes that are dedicated to trying to figure out what sort of response, is being offered. For example, have you heard of these overheard at kind of memes, like overheard at the mall, overheard on campus, right? There's one that captivated my imagination a number of years ago at Disneyland, where this father and son were walking around, and the son asked a question. No idea what the question was, but the father's response was, yeah, longus magungus. And I want to know what was the question. I'm dying to know what was the question. And I'm wondering, do you guys have any examples of this kind of overhearing something out of context? It sort of is just striking, maybe a little bizarre. Do you have any examples of this to share?
As a parent, I once heard my wife say, "Get that penguin butt out of your mouth."
Amazing.
And yeah, you guys didn't know what was going on there.
I was walking by the quilters room at my church and just overheard, murder has been a problem in my life. It's kind of an ongoing joke at our staff now because we have no idea what she's talking about.
Yeah, wow, those are brilliant examples. I love it because out of context, we want to know what prompted that response, right? And so I did a little search to see if maybe I could find one related to Bethel, an overheard at Bethel. I couldn't find an overheard at Bethel page, but I did find this on the English department's Facebook page. Oh, we've got to push this as well. They posted this back in August of 2016. First day of class, overheard in the hallway this morning. I need to talk with you about a book I read this summer. That book punched me in the face. I want to know what book that was, right? I want to read that book. If a book had that sort of response, I want to know about it, right? Well, so what we're going to do now is we're going to try and discover a little bit what elicited the response that we have in Galatians in particular. Okay, so we're going to look at some background issues to get started. If you have any questions, any issues of clarification, like me to repeat, please go ahead and raise your hand, chime in, and I'll be happy to do that. So with background issues, the main question is, who is Paul writing to? This is actually a very tricky discussion. I don't know if we're terribly familiar with the whole North Galatia, South Galatia debate. It's quite the debate, and there are a lot of issues at stake related to chronology of Paul's development of doctrine, the dating of Galatians in particular, for example. We're not going to dive into all of this, but when we think about the audience, who are these Galatians? Paul calls them Galatians. The ethnic Galatians primarily lived up in the north central area of Anatolia, ancient Turkey. But during Paul's day, the province of Galatia was actually much larger than where the ethnic Galatians lived. It included the cities of Pisidian Antioch, Lystra, Derbe, and Iconium, the places that Paul visited during his first missionary journey in Acts 13 and 14. Now, the province of Galatia was redrawn at several points over the first 3 centuries AD. It was redrawn in 74, it was redrawn in the 170s, and then finally in 297, successively to make it smaller and smaller, to where it basically just included the northern ethnic Galatians. And so all subsequent thought about, well, who was Paul writing to, only knew of a Galatia that was limited to the north central area. And it wasn't until the 19th century that anything really changed. And so the question is, okay, so who is Paul writing to? Well, in the 19th century, Sir William Ramsay, he wrote a Galatians commentary based upon his archaeological work in the area of what was South Galatia in Paul's day, to see if perhaps this is to whom Paul was writing. And really ever since then, the South Galatia view has become a very dominant view, and it has increased quite a bit over the years. And I just want to list two arguments. I'm kind of flying over this because there's a lot involved, but two kind of quick arguments archaeologically is that there's no evidence of Jewish presence in the northern Galatia area. And that's a really significant issue considering how Jewish the kind of conflict is in Galatia, right? Related to the law, related to circumcision. That's a very significant archaeological point. The next one, the road system. There was no road system in play for Paul to really have traveled that far north. The main road would have gone through the southern cities. So that's a really significant archaeological point as well. There are other things we can talk about. We're going to kind of be brief here. But what's interesting is that the main expert on Anatolia, Stephen Mitchell, he wrote this 2-volume Oxford publication on ancient Turkey, and he's not a Bible scholar, and he chimes in on this discussion, and he says there's virtually nothing to be said for the North Galatian theory. And I think that's pretty telling, right? The people who know Turkey best, people who know ancient Anatolia best, really don't have much to say about the Northern Galatia hypothesis. So if we can build off of the strength of the South Galatian theory for a little bit, what I want to do is I want to take you on a little bit of a virtual tour through Pisidian Antioch, the main city in that southern Galatia region. And Pisidian Antioch is a veteran colony. It's a veteran colony primarily of these military figures from Rome. So it's kind of like a Rome away from Rome, a real strong military presence here. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of walk our way through the city a little bit, up to the very height of the city, to the highest point. And so if you kind of imagine, so walking down this ancient road, marketplaces on either side as we kind of scroll through, and as we kind of turn to make our way up the hill, okay, we're going to see on our way down, we're going to see a theater kind of up to the left. If you can see that. There's a closer up. Now, as we get to kind of the end of the road, making our way to like the very height of the city, at this point there would be a large arch covering the road, and upon it would be an inscription of the Res Gestae Divi Augustus, the great deeds of the divine Augustus. And this inscription would have been in Latin, and it would have said all these great things that Caesar has done. And the reason why the inscription would be in Latin and not the common language of the day, which is Greek, is because this is a Roman colony, right? This is a veteran, militaristic colony. And so all the other evidence that we have of the Res Gestae elsewhere is in Greek, but here it's in Latin, which is very significant. But as we go through the arch, we make our way to the very, very top of this area. Well, here's some, oh, you can't see it. Sorry, this is some of the evidence of the inscription. Okay, if we had the lights up here, you'd be able to spot some of that. But as we make our way through the arch, we come to this very prominent temple dedicated to Caesar. Okay, so the various people in the community, as part of their civic responsibility, would have participated in this temple called paying homage to Caesar, and making sacrifices, praying to Caesar, right? Divi Augustus, he's the divine Augustus, right? So this temple here, very prominently displayed at the very end of the road, at the highest point in the town, through this archway that declares the great deeds of Augustus, right? Imagine the symbolism and just the weight and presence of this. So what I'm going to do, as you can see, the hill has kind of been carved out. What I'm going to do, these are pictures from my trip in 2011. I'm I'm going to kind of walk around so we can get a nice 360 view here. And you'll see the road that we just came up, right? Looking back across. You can see some of the foundation. You can imagine just how epic this would have been. Again, the road we just came up. And then all along the etched hill, carved out hill, you'll see the columns that would have, aligned all the way across. And so a really prominent display of power and Caesar's might. And it's not just Pisidian Antioch that was like this. Even Derbe, one of the other South Galatian cities, during the reign of Claudius, was renamed Claudia Derbe, just to show that the allegiance that was there and the significance of Rome's presence. And so what I want to think about is the possibility that the Roman imperial cult played a role in the conflict in Galatia. Now, it's not mentioned, and so this is a tricky possible issue of background, and it raises one of the hermeneutical theories of relevance theory. Have we talked about relevance theory in a hermeneutics course? This is the idea that what's relevant to a conversation or any sort of communication might not necessarily be communicated explicitly. It might be part of the shared background, the assumed background, so not explicitly mentioned. So I want to talk about the possibility that maybe the imperial cult is part of that assumed background, part of that shared background. And so to kind of illustrate this as a way to start, I want to do a quick little exercise. Okay, I've got a quote from a speech up here. And I want you to think about what is explicitly stated in this speech. Okay, think about what's explicitly stated. And I want to talk about what's explicitly stated. If you know where it's from, let's try to resist the urge to comment. Let's just focus on what's explicit. Okay. So if somebody would read it for us, that would be fantastic. Who would like to do it? Yeah.
Good morning. In less than an hour, aircraft from here will join others from around the world, and you will be launching the largest aerial battle in the history of mankind. Mankind. That word should have new meaning for us all today. We can't be consumed by our petty differences anymore. We will be united in our common interests. Perhaps it's fate that today is the 4th of July, and you will once again be fighting for our freedom, not from tyranny, oppression, or persecution, but from annihilation. We're fighting for our right to live, to exist. And should we win this day, the 4th of July will no longer be known as American holiday, but as the day when the world declared with one voice, we will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today we celebrate our Independence Day.
Brilliant. Wow, brilliant. That was great. So, only explicitly, what is this speech about?
An aerial battle.
An aerial battle?
Apparently a very big one.
Very big.
The biggest one in humankind's history.
Yeah.
A fight for freedom.
Fight for freedom.
It's on the 4th of July.
It's on the 4th of July.
The world seems united. It's not just
Or it
America.
needs to be.
It's-
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's at nighttime. We will not go quietly into the night.
Oh, that's possible.
Or the morning. It's morning, because it says
Good morning.
Sure.
Oh, we're fighting right then and
That would
there.
be indirect discourse.
Amen. Push it.
Any other comments about what this is about explicitly?
You might already with me on this, but the word "our" would then therefore be representing the entire world.
Okay.
When it says existence and living.
Sure, yeah. Very good, very good. Okay, so what's this about? Not just explicitly, but in terms of shared background, who knows where this is from?
Independence.
Independence.
Yeah, this is from a movie about aliens. Right? This is from a movie about aliens. Now, were aliens mentioned once in that? Not once, right? So it's interesting, right? There's no mention of aliens, but that's what the whole speech is about, right? From beginning to end, it's about the threat the imminent threat of these aliens, right? So there's this shared background, this issue of relevance there. There's this shared background that's not explicitly communicated, but it doesn't necessarily need to be, because everybody in attendance knows what's at stake, knows who the threat is, right? So I want to think about this in relation to Galatians a little bit. Let's think about what is sort of apparent from the letter, and then kind of talk about a little bit about maybe some of the assumed issues of background. So what's apparent in Galatians? What's quite clear? What's Galatians about? What can we say? Some stuff about Galatians.
People going back to the law.
Okay, yeah. Going back to the law.
Grace.
Grace. Some other.
The Spirit's presence in our life.
Ah, yeah.
The fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah.
I think faith versus the law.
Yeah.
That conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, very good, very good. So here in Galatians, we have very early days in the Christian community. In my opinion, based upon the whole South Galatian discussion, I actually regard this as the earliest Christian document that we have. Some might say 1 Thessalonians. I think, it's really one or the other at the end of the day for me. I think Galatians is quite early. And so the issue of, do Gentiles need to be circumcised and follow the law? Do they need to become Jewish? Has not been particularly spelled out, right? These are early days. The Gentile mission is taking off, right? And Paul's winning converts, right? And this is happening all throughout Turkey, and if it's written later, of course, in Greece and everything. But what about when the Jews in the community, right, are kind of faced with this issue of being a part of the same group as these Gentiles who are not following the law, who are not circumcised? What needs to happen at that point? It's a Jewish movement, after all. It's Israel's Messiah, right? How does Gentile inclusion play itself out? Well, what we can tell from the letter is that there's this group of troublemakers, Paul calls them, these agitators, right? These opponents of his, who are saying that if they want to be children of Abraham, they've got to become circumcised, right? They've got to follow the law if they want to be a part of the family of God, if they want to be a part of the people of God. And so Paul, right, he's very frustrated with this idea because this undermines his sense of calling, and it undermines the whole Gentile mission as far as he is concerned, right? And so he says, you guys don't need to become circumcised. You don't need to follow the law. You've already received the Spirit. You've been accepted by God, right? You've been justified by faith, right? And you are children of God and children of Abraham already. You've been adopted, right? And through baptism, right, you're united with Christ. You have participated in the cross, and the cross creates a new world in which the divisions of race, gender, and status no longer apply, right? They no longer separate and tear us apart. And to go to the law is actually to revert back, right? It's to go back in time, or to go to another realm, right? The cross has created this new reality, new creation, right, as he calls it at the end of the letter. And so if that's kind of the apparent, what we can kind of glean pretty straightforwardly from what's happening in the letter, what's maybe some of the assumed background? So I want to think about this idea about the imperial cult possibly contributing to this, and what might that look like, right? So the imperial cult sort of necessitates that everybody participate. All of the sort of regular pagan person, they're supposed to participate in the cult. They're supposed to be active in it. And if they don't, this is kind of like civic, not meeting their civic duties, not meeting their civic responsibilities. And it's to undermine the status quo, right? Jews were exempt. They were exempt from this. They did not have to participate. They would pray for Caesar, but they would not pray to Caesar. That was an important distinction because of their aversions to idolatry, right? So that was something that was kind of kept for them. Well, imagine Paul's communities, right? A mix of Jews and Gentiles who've accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Okay? Imagine from Rome's perspective, okay? You have these Gentiles who are formerly participating in the cult, right? Because you have to. Formally participating in the cult, and then they just stop. but they have no legal basis to stop, right? And as far as Rome is concerned, the Jews that they're in communion with are perhaps complicit, right, in some sort of cover-up, right? You have this community where some of them are legally allowed to abstain, and some have no legal basis to abstain. Because what's the clear, observable indication to a Roman authority that a male, for example, is a Jew? The very clear thing is circumcision, right? I mean, there are customs and observances that would go along with this, but that's going to be the obvious proof, right? And so the way that this sort of seems to play out, and we're going to look at this in the letter, some evidence for this, it seems like the pressure from the kind of social expectations upon the community has in turn created some of the Jews in the community to then look at the Gentiles and say, guys, just get it together, get circumcised already. Let's put this whole thing at rest so that we can all just kind of get on and we can maintain some kind of normalcy, right, in the community and in the city at large, right? And so, as far as Paul is concerned, the idea of being circumcised in this context, right? I mean, he can circumcise Timothy. Why does he upset here, right? Let's think about that, right? You know, in Acts, why is he so upset here? I think there's something more going on, right? It seems, as far as Paul is concerned, that to receive circumcision in this context, right, in this context of social tension and social pressure, is to deny the cross. It's to deny aligning oneself with the crucified Messiah. It's to reject, right, his sufferings, to participate with him in the cross. And you also have to think from the other perspective, why would grown men be interested in circumcision, right? I mean, to be honest, if you think about the ancient world, we have all of these examples of God-fearers who do not go all the way, right? They don't fully convert. There's a whole experience of this where you have Gentiles who are sympathetic, but they don't ultimately convert in terms of circumcision. So what's going to uniquely make Paul's converts, of all people, right, want to do it? Right? Something more that seems to be going on, and so I want to take a look at how the imperial cult may be contributing to this a little bit. So what we're going to do, because we need to be brief considering the time constraints, instead of kind of overviewing the whole book, okay, I want to look at the end of the letter. Look at the end of the letter. Look at chapter 6 and verses 11 to 17. And use that as a kind of launching pad from which to talk about the main themes that are in the letter. And part of the reason for this is because many have recognized that these last few verses are a kind of hermeneutical key to understanding the letter, that they contain some of the main themes and shed light on how to interpret other aspects of the letter. And so what's also interesting about this final section as a kind of window into what's going on is it appears to be the most specific in terms of the conflict, the most direct of all the information that we have. So in terms of relevance theory, this is probably the closest that we're going to get to figuring out what is this assumed and shared background to the conflict. Okay? Paul talks about their motivation, right? These opponents who are promoting circumcision, talks about their motivation, and then he talks about his response, which is entirely centered on the cross. All right, so we're going to look at this, we're going to launch into other aspects of Galatians from here. So if I could have somebody read this for us, that would be wonderful. Yes, thank you.
Behold what big letters I wrote to you in my own hand. For as many as wish to have a good showing in the flesh, these compel you to be circumcised, only in order that they might not be persecuted for the cross of the Messiah. For those who are circumcised do not keep the law themselves, but wish for you to be circumcised, in order that they might boast in your flesh. But far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus, the Messiah, through whom the world was crucified to me, and I to the world. For neither circumcision is anything, nor foreskin, but a new creation. And as many as line up to this rule, peace upon them and mercy, even upon the Israel of God. For the remainder of time, let no one cause me trouble, for I bear in my body the marks of Jesus.
Awesome. Thank you, thank you. So let's go ahead and work through this kind of bit by bit. So at the very start here, Paul says, "Behold what big letters I wrote to you in my own hand." Why do you write big letters? Have any of you heard the idea that he had poor eyesight? Has anybody heard
Yeah.
this? It's a kind of popular idea, and where it gets some traction is from chapter 4, when Paul talks about his weakness of the flesh. He says that, when I was formerly with you and I was preaching the gospel, at first I had this weakness of the flesh, but you guys did not reject or despise me. You received me as Jesus, and you were willing even to gouge out your eyes and give them to me. And so people thought, oh, Paul probably had poor eyesight. Well, that has sort of, the attention on that has sort of shifted away, and people have focused on the language of rejecting and despising and saying, the weakness of the flesh is probably not poor eyesight, but maybe because the language of rejection is actually spitting. It's actually the word lecture1, which, can we just be honest for a second, that is the best Greek word, right? It sounds like what it means, right? Lecture1. It's amazing. But what Paul is saying is, you did not spit at me. And the reason why he would say that is on the one hand, suffering in the ancient world, right, was thought to be accompanied by sort of curses from the gods and demons, and so the idea of spitting would be a way to kind of an apotropaic practice of saying, keep away, whatever curse you may have, whatever God is upset with you, stay away from me. And so you spit at them. That's one aspect of this. The other is that people have thought that Paul actually had epilepsy. And that was actually the thorn in the flesh that he had. And so you would spit at somebody who had a spitting disease. And so that would be the kind of association. I'm wondering why people don't actually connect this more with verse 19, where Paul says that, I'm in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. I'm still waiting for an article to say that the weakness of the flesh was actually morning sickness. You heard it here first. But no, people have suggested all these different things, like, let's try and diagnose what the weakness of the flesh is. But the idea of poor eyesight has basically just sort of kind of gone away. And so why is he writing in big letters? Why is he writing in big letters? To scribal habits and the way that Paul used scribes and amanuenses. The more we've learned about how Paul, relied upon scribes, and what we see here is Paul kind of taking, pen in hand and writing for himself. And there's a transition there. For example, like if we're going to ask a trick question, who wrote Romans? Who wrote Romans?
Eusebius?
No.
Silas?
No. A guy named Tertius. Chapter 16, verse 22. So Paul wrote Romans, but literally Tertius wrote Romans, right? And so Paul used scribes. He used scribes. And what we see here is that transition in the text where he's starting to write with his own hand. And yet, for emphasis, he is writing in big letters. It's sort of like the ancient equivalent of using bold-faced type or all caps to communicate. And so, as I said, we're going to focus on this final section because it's a kind of hermeneutical key to the letter, but it seems like even Paul himself is sort of announcing that it is that kind of hermeneutical key, because he's saying, pay attention to this, right? Look at my large letters. Don't miss what I've got to say for you guys, right? And what he's immediately going to transition to is the motivation of the agitators, these opponents, right? He says, for as many as wish to have a good showing in the flesh, these compel you to be circumcised, only in order that they might not be persecuted for the cross of the Messiah. For those who are circumcised do not keep the law themselves, but wish for you to be circumcised, in order that they might boast in your flesh. So notice that they don't want to be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Who's persecuting them? Where is this coming from, right? Well, in light of the relevance theory, there are a couple of different possibilities here. But I think the one that makes a lot of sense, and actually this view goes back to Jerome, and recently it's become somewhat more championed, is this idea that it was Roman officials who were creating the pressure on the situation. It could be a mix of local officials, whether it's got some Jews from the synagogue. I don't think we need to spell it out too much. And at the end of the day, all we know is that Paul is cluing us into the fact that there is some other pressure upon the situation that is provoking immediately what's taking place. So there's a kind of three-tiered sort of pressure, right? You have this external group, possibly Rome. I think that makes a lot of sense historically. You have this external group who's pressuring the group, and then certain Jews within the community who are already circumcised are pressuring those Gentiles who aren't to finally go ahead and do it. In fact, it says that they're compelling you to be circumcised. This is really interesting because whenever that Greek word anakazo is used with circumcision in Josephus and the Maccabean literature, it's describing forced circumcision, right? It's pressure, it's intense pressure to be circumcised. I think we often think of the agitators as sort of advocating circumcision, like, hey, I think this is a good idea, you should give it a try. But it seems like there's something a little bit more aggressive, divisive, a little bit more coercive taking place because of the pressure that's upon them. They don't want to be persecuted for the cross of Christ. They're in turn applying pressure upon those within the community. Now notice the references to the flesh. The references to the flesh. There's a strong emphasis on the flesh with these guys because, of course, they're promoting circumcision, right? And this association of this kind of compulsion and divisive behavior and the flesh is actually something Paul has been kind of working throughout the letter as a critique of the agitators. I want to look at a couple of places where we see this most explicitly. In the famous vice list of chapter 5, where it talks about all these things that, we should avoid, we tend to think of this as a kind of generic list. Like here's just a general list of things that we should avoid, right? We can look at that list and say, oh yeah, Christians shouldn't be about any of those things, right? Makes sense. Especially when you look at what's on the edges of it. What I've highlighted in red there. Those look fairly general, right? Any situation, you announce those things, oh yeah, we don't want to have anything to do with those things. Especially notice the last little bit, and things such as these, right? It's kind of a catch-all, right? This is not meant to be exhaustive. There's a whole lot of vices that should not be true of Christians. But notice what's in the middle. All of these references to divisive behavior, to behavior that would undermine the unity and solidarity of the community. It seems like Paul is sort of associating the flesh and these agitators to say that they're promoting division in their promotion of circumcision. They're being, yes?
I just wanted to ask, why is sorcery in that list?
Boom, we're going to jump right to that right now. Yeah, so the Greek word there, pharmakeia. Okay, don't get any weird ideas about pharmacy and the Greek word there, pharmakeia, okay, Paul never uses in any other vice list. Never uses it anywhere else. Why would he use it here? In fact, the word really only occurs in Revelation, and it occurs in a vice list and one other place in chapter 15. So why here? Why here? Well, again, I think this is a great clue to the fact that this is not strictly general. I mean, it has general vices in it as a way of saying that I think the agitators are promoting works of the flesh. They're exuding works of the flesh, right? Primarily by what's included here in the middle. The sorcery example, think about that famous passage in chapter 3. Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? That's evil eye language, which is the manipulative, control, sorcery type language. Now, why sorcery here? I think this is a great clue that he's critiquing the agitators. Paul never talks about sorcery like this anywhere else. Why here? If this is a general list, that's kind of odd, right? It's kind of odd. And why the emphasis on division? Why the emphasis on a lack of unity and turmoil? I think because he's tailored it to the agitators as a critique, right? They are promoting the works of the flesh. They're not promoting the fruit of the Spirit, for example. The other great place is at the end of the allegory. Now, the allegory is just a very tricky section, right? Galatians 4, the last bit of Galatians 4. Has anybody spent many sleepless nights wondering what Paul is trying to say in the allegory of Galatians 4? Is it just me? Yeah. Yeah. So when I had my first supervision with NT Wright, I asked him, when you're at these conferences and you're speaking and you have lines of people queuing up to ask you questions, are you ever just sort of nervous, like, oh, I hope they don't ask me that? What's the one thing you don't want to be asked? And he said, oh, that's easy. I don't want to be asked about the meaning of the allegory of Galatians 4. I was like, oh my goodness. And so every time I come to this text, I'm like, all right, it's with fear and trembling that I proceed, right? Because it's very tricky, and there's all these twists and turns when you look at the first part of the allegory. So we're not going to talk about, what does Paul mean when he says that Hagar is Mount Sinai, which corresponds to the present Jerusalem, and she is the slaver. We're not going to talk about that. What I want to look at is verses 28 and 29. Because this is where Paul applies what he's just done to the situation in Galatia. Okay? Earlier in the allegory, what he's done is he said that Abraham has two sons, right? You have Isaac and you have Ishmael. And this is a really important twist in the argument. The only thing I really want to say about this is it's sort of like Paul has said, okay, you guys, you want to say that you have to be circumcised in order to be a child of Abraham? Well, you are right to an extent, but you're talking about the wrong kind of children of Abraham, right? He's now splitting up, right, the offspring of Abraham a bit. It's sort of like when you're playing a game of pickup basketball, and there's that point where you're throwing the ball to the wrong team over and over again. What happens? What do you do to rectify the situation?
Shirts and skins.
Shirts and skins, exactly. We need to be very clear about who's on which team, right? And this is what Paul's doing here. He's saying, yes, really we have two families. We have Team Isaac, right? They're associated with the Spirit. They're associated with experiencing persecution. They're associated with the promise. And you have Team Ishmael, associated with the flesh. They're Team Skins, by the way. Right? They are enacting persecution, right? They are enacting persecution. And so notice what Paul says. He applies it to them. He says, but you, brothers and sisters, are children like Isaac, according to promise. And just as then the one born according to the flesh persecuted the one born according to the Spirit, the same is true now. We see the agitators, these people who are promoting circumcision, they're the flesh people who are persecuting the children of the Spirit, right? And so Paul has made these associations elsewhere in the letter. And so when we return to Galatians 6, we see what Paul has to say in response to this promotion of circumcision and both the fleeing of persecution and the enacting of it in the way that compels circumcision. He says, but far be it from me to boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus the Messiah, through whom the world was crucified to me and I to the world. For neither circumcision is anything nor foreskin, but a new creation. And what we have here is Paul talking about how the cross creates a new reality. There's a kind of transfer that takes place, right? A transfer into this new reality of the Spirit that he calls new creation. There's this death and new life pattern, right? And this is a pattern that we see all throughout Galatians. And I want to kind of take a look at a couple of these. For example, at the very end of Galatians 2, Paul says, I have been crucified with the Messiah, but I live. No longer I, but the Messiah lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, the one who loved me and gave himself for me. Right? That death and new life pattern. Paul is now energized by the Messiah. Right? The Messiah lives in me, he says. And then in Galatians 5, right after that vice list, the works of the flesh, right, we see the fruit of the Spirit. Paul says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faith, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those who belong to the Messiah crucify the flesh with its passions and desires. And if we are animated by the Spirit, let's line up with the Spirit. You see the same death and new life pattern. And in this instance, he goes on to talk about what this new life, what this new creational life energized by the Spirit looks like, right? It looks like these fruit of the Spirit. And notice what he says. Against such things there is no law. Right? The issue is, do these Gentiles need to start following the law? And the pressure is from these agitators. Yes, they do. Right? This is what God wants. And Paul is sort of saying, you know what? If you're in this new realm of the Spirit, if you participate in the cross, you're going to fulfill the law accidentally, without even trying, right? If you're producing these things, what law is there that's going to condemn you? There is no law that's going to condemn you, right? You don't need it, right? And this is part of the problem with the law. The law is holy and good, as Paul says in Romans 7, right? But it cannot affect what it prescribes, right? And this is the difference with the Spirit, right? The Spirit energizes and produces these things, right? So when we talk about spiritual formation, we need to talk about spirit formation, right? How the Spirit works in us and transforms us. What's amazing about this, so if you think about what Paul has said here in Galatians 5 earlier, he says that love of neighbor is what fulfills the law, right? And this is what the Spirit produces in us, right? It's not our own doing, it's what the Spirit does, right? And you'll notice here, faith. The Greek word is pistis, it's not pistos, but all of our translations, most of them, will render this as faithfulness. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that, except that I think it obscures the fact that what we're talking about here is the same thing that justifies us, right? It is the pistis, right? How do we understand the pistis Christou debate, right? And at the end of the day, we have to have faith, right? Because even in 2:16, Paul says that we have to believe in the Messiah Jesus, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with that whole debate and discussion about pistis Christou, objective and subjective genitives.
It was actually in our stuff today.
Oh, good.
It was the love of God, but it was.
Oh, sure.
But it's the same general principle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So there's a little debate about whether faith of Christ means, we put our faith in Christ or Christ's faithfulness, right? It's justification because of what Christ has done or because of our faith in Him. And of course, the way I just phrased it, well, it's both, right? And the reason why we put our faith in Him is because of what Christ has done, right? So the debate, it's an interesting one. I didn't want to spend too much time on that, but the idea here, though, is that faith is something that the Spirit produces, right? The faith that justifies us is part of the fruit of the Spirit. The love that fulfills the law is part of the fruit of the Spirit. This is not pull yourself up by your bootstraps. This is the Spirit working in us. And so when we talk about spiritual formation, we also don't want to be abstract, right? These 9 things, right, are what we're talking about when we're talking about spiritual formation. We're talking about seeing more love and joy in us, and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faith and gentleness and self-control, right? The other thing, we also don't want to isolate these, because what's the Greek word for fruit? The Greek word for fruit? Karpos. And it's in the singular here. It's not in the plural. We're not talking about fruits of the Spirit. We're talking about the fruit of the Spirit, right? So we don't want to isolate and say, I've got about 7 of those down. No, that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the Spirit forming these things in us, right? Now, and this is part of that death and new life dynamic, right? Of what's going on with what the cross has inaugurated. And when we go back to Galatians 6, and we look at how Paul has said that he boasts in the cross, and how the cross has created this new creation in which circumcision and uncircumcision don't matter, right? They're both irrelevant, right? It's just an irrelevant issue. Notice what he says in verse 16. He says, and as many as line up with this rule, peace upon them and mercy, even upon the Israel of God. This is a really tricky passage, and the reason is primarily with that last little bit, even upon the Israel of God. But the first question we should ask is, what's this rule? What's this rule? Well, the rule seems to be the rule of new creation, the rule where circumcision and uncircumcision are irrelevant. They're just irrelevant in creation, right? So those who follow this rule, Paul says, peace upon them. Now the question is the Israel of God the same group, or is it a different group? And there's a whole set of theological debates that revolve around this. For example, if we might be more inclined towards dispensationalism, we might give a particular answer to this, that these are different groups, right? Not the same sort of group. And so if we are dispensational, I'd be happy to chat about this. I take this a little bit differently. I think the group that follows the rule, Paul goes on to call the Israel of God. So I think Israel, according to the flesh, has been marked out by circumcision, right? But Paul wants to say that there is an Israel of God made up of Jews and Gentiles who are not so marked out. They're not marked out by circumcision, right? They follow this rule of new creation, this new community, right, that does not hold these former ways of dividing us as having any sort of power, right? And I think the passage that communicates this best is the baptismal passage in Galatians 3:26 to 29. Because here we have a similar death and new life pattern. We also have the Jew-Gentile emphasis, right? Take a look at this passage. For all are children of God through faith in the Messiah Jesus. For as many as were baptized into the Messiah have put on the Messiah. There is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, no male and female. For all of you are one in the Messiah Jesus. If you belong to the Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. Now notice the language of children of God and Abraham's seed, right? Isn't that what the Israel of God is, right? Sons of God, right? Israel are the sons of God. So I think this language of children of God and Abraham's seed, right, going together, I think is very, very striking.